Today, I'm talking to John Levett. Hi, John. Good to see you.
Hi, Vic.
How are you, mate?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good, good. So, traditional first question is, what do you do?
Well, I'm retired from the world of proper work, but for however, for the last 23 years, I've been a music agent and promoter. And in fact, prior to that, I worked in computing, and the longest industry I worked in was electricity for 14 years. So now to have been a music agent for 23 years, and in fact, I look back as a computer person, I wrote some fantastic computer programs, all of which are consigned to history and no one will ever remember. But people do come up to me and say, that was a great gig in 2002 or whatever. And I think, this is what I think is. And in fact, when I go right back to when I was in my late teenage 20 years, like a student, I did used to put on little gigs in pubs and things. And so to a certain extent, I've always been connected with this type of thing. So
that's fascinating. That's fascinating because on our little preamble at the beginning, before we press record, I was saying to you, there's often these little things that pop up earlier.
Yeah.
That you sort of look, in hindsight, you look back and go, I've always done this one way or another. But it's not until you sort of look back that you start to see these little threads.
Well, I'll tell you how it happened. You see, when I had a proper job, the last one was with the Central Electricity. Well, it was in the I worked for the Central Electricity Generating Board, which employed 70,000 people, looked after all the power stations, and I expected to work there until I was 65. That was my job forever. And then Mrs. Thatcher privatized it. And I ended up in National Grid. Yeah. And then my job was outsourced to India. And I was invited to retire early. They give you more money than you could sue them for wrongful dismissal.
Yes.
And so here I am. What am I going to do? And I was outplaced, and they feel a bit guilty about it. So they send you to an agency that helps you find other work. And you're taught not to get the next job, but this could happen again and again. So you give them a personality test. And so they gave me this test and they said, you ought to consider something artistic. I said, well, why do you say that? He said, well, there was a question that said, would you rather go to a football match or read a poem? I said, I wasn't too keen on either, but I'd probably prefer to read a poem. And on the strength of that one question in that test, the guy said, look, you need to think about artistic. Well, in fact, I became an interim program manager for computing projects around about the millennium. I thought I got a company through the millennium bug, which it did exist. Anyway, however, at the same time, my son was studying jazz drumming at the Guildhall School of Music. I thought, how on earth is he going to get work? And the Stag did Dixieland Jazz at the time, once a month. And so I went to the Stag Theatre in Sevenoaks. And I said, would you like to do you ought to do some modern jazz as well. And they said, oh, no, it wouldn't sell. You can do it if you like, John. So I started doing a modern jazz session once a month in the Stag. And it all came from that. Almost everything I do, people have asked me to help. And I've just got involved in more and more things.
That's amazing. So you see, again, this is one of those. I said to you there that lots of little themes that crop up in the podcast that I do, and when it only just happens to you, you just think you don't think anything of it. But when you see it happening with lots and lots of different people, you realise that that is something that is a consistent. So this thing of there's no actual plan. You just something that occurs. You have an idea and you go and speak to somebody, and nobody actually turns around and says, "Oh, that's a really good idea." They go, "Yeah, okay. Well, why don't you ever go out doing that?" and you sort of fall into it, you know. So that's quite interesting, because again, you made a point about, again, before we recorded, and I said we've got to be careful we don't miss some of these points because they were so good, about people being musicians or professional footballers, and this illusion that there's almost a career path, right? And because there's not really a career path for anything now. Because again, I could totally agree with your thing about this idea you would have a job that was the job for life.
Well, can I just butt in slightly? If you say you wanted to become an accountant, everybody who worked hard can get the proper qualification and be an accountant. But it's not the same for football and music. You can work. No,
but it's not the same for a lot of things, actually. Now.
Oh, okay.
Because again, you could have, if you go back to, because we're of a certain age, obviously, people said, well, you get a job in whatever, and you think that's your job for life. And they would have quoted lots of things, you know, banking, because let's look what's happening now with banks. You know, the post office.
Oh yes, be a postman.
Well, not just a postman, but working within, you know, within that. And because there wasn't this sort of disruptive technology that was sort of, because you said about early days of computing, where you'd have a massive computer just to store documents, right? So even computing wasn't a disruptive technology as such.
No.
And people didn't really know what it was going to do until it started doing it. So we've got this sort of idea of, you know, it's almost like an old-fashioned idea of a career path, which people still think about with regard to the arts, instead of it being like this sort of an entrepreneurial thing where you get an idea and you do something with it and then maybe get rid of that one and start something else, you know. So I'm sort of interested. So go back to the thing about your son. So your son was interested, obviously, a good drummer if he's doing jazz drumming at the Guildhall. There must have been a lot of music going on in the house for somebody to pick up on that. I mean, what was his
We've always been a musical family. I mean, my wife was an oboist and pianist, and she taught piano at home, and she taught both children to sing well. In fact, my son was a cathedral chorister at Peterborough Cathedral.
Oh.
Been a great disappointment to my wife. He didn't become a singer. But anyway, he chose the drums. And he's still a musician. And he's recently taken up the chromatic harmonica and done really well with it, which he perfected during the lockdown to such an extent that people get him to put, you know, harmonica tracks on albums and stuff like that. So
now that's his skill of singing coming out.
Well, the thing is,
chromatic harmonica is,
I mean, there's lots of competition for drummers, whereas not that many people can get their lips around a chromatic harmonica.
Exactly. Yeah. So that wasn't a wasted thing, was it? Singing?
Oh no, not at all. Well, that's the other thing. It come back to your other point that you're making. I'm really, in a way, I never ended up doing what I really wanted to do till I was in my 60s. Whereas for my son to do it straight away in life, it's not as if there's lots of fantastic alternatives anyway. As long as you have to be prepared to teach an instrument, learn another instrument, do all sorts of different things, and be ready for a whole multiplicity of projects.
Yes, exactly. Which is what I'm saying. It's more the sort of entrepreneurial way of, look at things and go, there's an opening there for me to do something. So this is interesting for me, listening to your story about you had the jobs, and then you get this out of the blue, get somebody say, well, have you thought about doing something artistic? Which is sort of strange, isn't it, from a point of view of careers advice or retraining advice?
Well, at that point, I mean, for example, I do a lot of my events happen to take place in private schools, and quite often the bursar who runs the school is used to be a military person of some kind, either the Air Force or the Army or in fact the Navy. And so when you've spent all your life fighting for your country, and then it, you do something completely different, but it utilizes your skills or your approach or some other attribute you have.
That's an interesting point, because that saying about a lot of bursaries from independent schools at ex-services, because I know that's true because it used to be true in King's in Rochester. They had a bursar there who was ex-army. But it's that ability to be able to see how a unit can work, if you see what I mean, how everything needs to fall into place for that to be a function. That is a skill just terribly difficult to learn unless you're having to do it, I must say.
Oh my goodness. I think when I look at my success in music, it's primarily because of my, claiming an ability to get on with groups of people. And long ago, when you work in a big company, you quite often get loads of training, or used to anyway, on how to deal with it, all these different things.
You used to. I don't know what you do now.
And you probably don't now. No. But I can remember one thing saying, the success of a team manager is the ability to accommodate difficult and unusual people in your team. And that has to be true, even more true in the musical world.
Oh my God.
Because you've got someone who's absolutely brilliant at music and might not have any of these other emotional skills, but it's important to incorporate them in the team if you want to have a good result.
Yes, that is a rabbit hole that we can go down and never come up again.
And people say, well, where do I fit in that spectrum, John? What do you think of me?
Yeah, I think that's a question that should never be asked.
No, exactly.
As long as if you don't want the true answer to be given. But that is so true, because again, the chemistry of a unit of people is absolutely crucial to their success, because again, you don't necessarily want the best player. You want the person who's the best fit. And that can mean somebody who is not necessarily your first choice, because sometimes these things come out of I was talking to somebody the other day actually about this, where I had a band where on paper the players were just incredible and they all knew one another and they weren't difficult people, but it just didn't work. And strangely, I sort of knew it wouldn't work, but I couldn't work out why I knew it wouldn't work. But when we started gigging, it became clear that there was just something not happening between the people. And this is why I think often, as you say, you've got to be able to allow people to be themselves within a group. You can't just be dictatorial. People have got to do their thing, but you still got to be able to focus it and be able to control it in some sort of way. That it works. And it's a bizarre set of skills that you need, I think, for that. So I think it's a really interesting point. So anyway, you showed me a flyer for something that I'd actually forgotten about before we started. You'd obviously been doing some stuff before that, hadn't you?
Yes. Well, I started off with this once a month in the Stag Theatre.
So that was the first thing you did?
That was the very first thing. And that was my son's fellow pupils. And I would invite their lecturers to be the guest. But after a while, my son said, "But I only get this gig because I'm your son." And he didn't seem to realise that nepotism makes the world go round. Yes. And equally, I found that for roughly the same money I was paying them, I could get professional musicians to come and play, as long as I let them play what they wanted to play. We're talking about jazz. So that carried on. And then people would come to me and say, "You must know some musicians. Can you fix a pianist for my wedding?" or something like that. So the agency side developed. And then people came to me and said, well, I think what happened, the thing we did with you was part of the 7 Night Summer Festival. And so I offered to help run the 7 Night Summer Festival, mainly because I wanted to get my events in it. But gradually I got drawn into doing promoting, really. Well, I put things on. That's when I asked you and some pupils to come and play for us. And then people realized I did that and said, would I curate a jazz series at the Brook Theatre in Chatham? And then a good friend of mine that did some blues in Crawley, they did jazz lunch. Well, they did what they called jazz lunches, and he put the jazziest blues bands he could find. And then they wanted to do more and more. And they said, oh, you better talk to John and do that. Well, decades later, loads of years later, I'm still doing those jazz lunches. And they've survived the pandemic. And we now do jazz dinners there. I'm in a nice big foyer at the Hall Theatre in Crawley. So everything just grows out of one thing to another, because I am retired. I mean, the electricity industry has left me with a pension. I don't have to do this to eat.
Yeah.
But there again, that's been the thing post-pandemic, particularly, that I'm in a position to do it. I mean, as things get, I can underwrite things or take a risk that even quite large venues can't anymore. Even the well, I could talk a lot about that.
No, do.
Well, I mean,
because I think this is important. If people are, involved in creativity, they've got to understand the other side of it. If they don't do, if they don't organise events themselves, I think it's important.
Well, if you look in the long sweep of history, all that music that we like about Mozart and Beethoven and all Vivaldi and all those, they were all only managed to do it because aristocrats gave them patronage.
Exactly.
That's how it happened. And in a way, if I've got some resources, some money, I'm a sort of patron, if you like, because and not only of individuals, and I'm not overdoing it in a sense, but just the fact I take the trouble to help them. It's some, a lot of things wouldn't happen if I hadn't helped. I now realize, and it's that even more the case now. I mean, people used to come to me. I hate the idea of I mentioned to you before this interview that I help people get through the Millennium Bug. Well, one of the organizations I did was Bernardo's. Got them through the Millennium Bug, which did exist. That's why we did such a good job.
Yeah, then people think it didn't.
Yeah, but they used to put on events for people who've been through Bernardo's, and they pay someone to put up a marquee. They pay for someone to put on the food, and they say, "Anyone know any musicians? Want some exposure?" The dreaded free gift for exposure. And so whenever anybody asks me to do that, I say, "No, I don't do that." But more recently, I've said. I've said to people, well, look, as long as you credit my agency, the Listening Room Music Agency, as having provided it, I'll do it. I'll pay them something, so they get some money. It won't be their normal fee. It'll be some sort of, they know it's a promotional thing, but I'm going to give them some money. But you must credit me with having done it. And that has helped. And in fact, after a while, in one instance, it became so successful, they've actually started to pay us for the music. It has improved. And so there are things like that where I can oil the wheels or make things happen. And I work with I work with Ray Russell, who's the chairman of the Seven Oaks Summer Festival now. And his granny once said to him, "Never let anything fail for the sake of your help," something like that. So it's that side of idea, which gives a lot of pleasure, really.
Yes. See, I like what you're saying here, because we always put a monetary value on things, and to the point that, and there's nothing wrong with that, but to the point that if something doesn't make sense financially, they won't do it. Now, some of the great things have come out of the fact that there wasn't any monetary value attached to a particular thing. It was done as you say, because if you go back to, so Mozart and Vivaldi, and they needed patronage. They needed to be teaching people or performing music, basically as some sort of music system. Because if you go back to people like Mozart and Vivaldi and Salieri and whatever, they were providing music for, as you say, to aristocrats or the royalty, but they were just, a music system, as we would think of it now, because that was it. Now, but really, there was no. Okay, they could have sort of thought of it that music was good for the soul or whatever it was. But from a financial point of view, there was no reason they needed to do that, apart from the fact that it was fashionable, to something that you did. But of course, what came of that is all this incredible music that these musicians produced, which wasn't the intention of that patronage particularly. But we could look at it to think that it was. But, in the hard sort of economic aspects of why people pay for things. So the interesting point for me is that what you do when you put on a gig and, something's done for charity, there is a spin-off that takes sometimes a long time before you see the real benefit of that. And you wouldn't have that in mind that that's why you're doing it. But lots of things come from people doing things, whether that's for free or, you're helping them to pay their costs or whatever, to do something that would not happen if you didn't do it. And I think that's one of the problems that we have, this sort of under the devaluing of the arts in education and all the rest of it. And it's not just arts, because I was talking to somebody recently about languages, a similar sort of situation. That if those things are in there, they have an effect that's beyond any financial involvement, beneficial. But you can't put those things on a balance sheet. It's like goodwill. And so what I wanted to talk to you about was, because I do something similar about getting kids playing in bands and stuff with me, and I've done that for years, and that's where Tom Morrison obviously appeared on that flyer, because this was something that you put on. It was me and Tony Harlow and Tom Morrison. Tom, as you said, was he was a very talented singer-songwriter actually, and I really thought this lad could have gone a long way. But as you say, there's no guarantee.
Oh, no.
And so there's a few points here. Tom did something very clever, because he was offered to be supported by somebody who was a good, had a really good sort of recording studio and everything. And Tom decided he didn't want to do that. He wanted to go traveling the world. He's done very well for himself, and he's also still doing music, as you're saying, as a hobby.
Yeah,
which is brilliant. Now, for some people, that's not their path. It was for Tom. Now, you raise a very interesting point about the way that things are portrayed in the media, with things like X Factor and all the rest of it. I wanted to focus on that because I think this is an interesting point. That it makes people think that there's a way of succeeding. And there is a way of succeeding, maybe, but it's not obvious. I just sort of put that there. Now, because you also said about football. So maybe you could just sort of say what you think, because what you said before we started recording, I thought was really important. Because you were saying about football academies and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I've seen been a bit of publicity about that recently, about the ones that get tossed away to one side and what happens to them, and how and they need mental health help, if nothing else. In fact, the better they were, the harder it is, perhaps, when it doesn't actually happen. Yes. But it's quite. There are other things that come into it, of course, here, because to be successful commercially now, you don't necessarily have to be a very good live performer because the techniques of production are so phenomenal. Whereas if you go back to the days of, Tom Jones and Dusty Springfield and all the rest of it, they couldn't get anywhere unless they could stand up with a pathetic PA system or no PA system at all and really sing and play. And so there's all sorts of things changing here. And I suppose being the age I am, which is 77 now, I've got a certain bias towards, can you actually do this stuff yourself? But I even though even now this conversation sort of starts off in all directions, really. I mean, one of the things that I used to run an open mic once a month in the Grey Lady. Did that for years and years and years and years and years. Haven't started it again after the pandemic. And we did it. It started off being a jazz open mic, so a jazz pianist and a jazz bass player. Towards the end, we let people sing anything, but nevertheless, we banished backing tracks. There was no backing track singing allowed. And of course, during the pandemic, what with Zooming and one thing and another, a lot of backing track singing came along. And I've now realized how hard it is to do. It's a skill of its own. And if you've got a jazz pianist playing for you, you miss a bar, he'll miss a bar, he'll make you sound brilliant. You got to stick to the track and know what you're doing. And also it can, there are situations. I got one of my jazz singers. She's now did a lot of backing track singing during the pandemic. I said, we could do that as a show, which of course other people have been doing for years. And so it's a question of adjusting to these technologies. And from my point of view, being aware that there's electronic music's been around for so long. One of the other things I do is I'm chairman of the Kent Youth Jazz Orchestra. Now, there are still enough young people who want to learn instruments, but not as many as used to. There's so many, the plethora of where all this is going to end up, I don't entirely know. But I suppose I still like live musicians playing live music. That's something that I think. And coming back to the other thing is whether you're going back to medieval times of patronage and wherever people get money now, what tends to happen is that the people who understand the music and talk to each other about the music are the musicians themselves. And because, I think it was, I'm not sure which one, but various musicians would walk hundreds of miles across Europe to go and hear Bach play the organ or something like that.
Actually, it was Bach. It was Bach who walked 300 miles to see
Buxtehude or somewhere.
Buxtehude play the organ. That's right.
That's right. Now, now today, when I put on a jazz gig and the guys turn up, they're all talking of each other, sessions they've just done, or have you heard of this guy, or this young kid's brilliant, or whatever. And so there is a musicality thread going through it that is independent of wherever the money's coming from.
Yes. So I'll tell you a little story about, because in the time that I've taught, I used to teach a lot of singing.
Right.
But it was always from the perspective of, because it's sort of contemporary, it was about performance and being able to express, finding your voice and performing. And talking about backing tracks was very interesting because people used to sing a lot with the original, with the original track. So they're singing over the top of the original vocal line.
Right.
And what became very apparent was as soon as you got the backing track, they didn't know where they were. Because they were obviously getting lots and lots of cues from the original track unconsciously that made that they were aware where they were coming in. Now, of course, if you're singing a song to a solo piano, that takes it to another level because so it's interesting that there are gradations in that finding yourself and finding the music inside yourself and knowing the song. So it doesn't matter if it's a piano or if it's a backing track or if it's solo, literally a cappella, right? That you could sing the song. And I think that's I always found that interesting. That,
well, I've always noticed myself the best singers are when they're singing the song. You think, I wonder if the band are going to be able to play with them, because I somehow the singers got it absolutely perfect, but the other guys are a bit out of tune. Because this singer knows the song so well, nothing's going to move them off what they're singing. Not many singers have got that level of. It's almost a gift. It's not really so much professionalism; it's their ability to do it.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. That there is this sort of, because we always want to map out things, don't we? Where we sort of go, you need to do this, and this, technically or whatever. But then there's this sort of thing which is a bit like, well, I don't know what that is. Somebody can just do that thing, and it's difficult to put your finger on exactly what it is that they're doing. Like you say, some sort of skill. Again, it's very much like a map, isn't it? A map is not the territory at all. It's just good for navigating the territory. And I think all the things like skills and abilities that you would think a great singer would need, or a great drummer or whatever, that's all the map. And then there's this other bit where somebody can do that thing in a particular way, and you just don't know how they do that, and they don't even know how.
Drumming is a good example, because everything has to be in the pocket, as they say.
Yes.
Which is the least. Nobody can define what it is.
Exactly.
Knows when it's not being done.
Exactly. And but again, I would say that might, going back to your football analogy.
Right.
I think that's true of football. And I don't follow football, but you get that thing where these people have got these skills, and then they've got something else. There's this knack of knowing, timing and space and awareness of, the relationship of where you are and where you need to be, and all that type of thing. And you can't really teach that. You can inspire it in people, I guess, but I don't know. And there's so many things in the arts like that. Even just knowing what thing to do and what not to do is, I think, one of those things. And whether that's the gig that you should do and the gig that you shouldn't do, or the notes that you should play and the notes you shouldn't play. So, okay, so we got this. We didn't really quite answer that thing about. So let's see if we can nail this thing. You're saying about people's perspectives now about what they could do and how they could succeed in art, music, or as you say, football. And the fact that there's a lot of things out there that give the people the illusion that there is a way. And you mentioned X Factor and stuff like that. What do you think? I'm not saying it's not really an answer, because there isn't an answer as such, but what do you think the pitfalls at the moment for people wanting to be musicians?
Sorry. Well, the pitfalls are, because you alluded earlier that it applies to everything. And when I was a teenager, I went to college. I was given a grant to go to college. It wasn't a full grant; it was a means-tested grant. And my parents topped it up, and I did a small job here and there. But and when I went into my job, I cannot get my head around the fact that you go to college to get some relatively lowly qualification now that almost the whole country has anyway, and end up with a debt of at least £53,000.
Yes, it's insane.
One of my saxophonists from the Kent Youth Jazz Orchestra, and he went to conservatoire. After a year, came home because he thought, I don't want to end up with that amount of debt, and I don't think this particular training is going to even help me get work as such. That's debatable, etc. But I think it comes back to whatever you do, you need to do it because you want to do it,
yes,
and be content with whatever you achieve, or enjoy the journey.
yes.
So I mean, I'm not sure she'd like me to. Well, I'll talk about my daughter. When my daughter went to music college, and she was more thinking about these sorts of things, about being massively famous, whatever. She's now a librarian and sings in church every Sunday. And I said, well, that's something to be really proud of. You'd be the best church singer you can. It's that type of thing. And that's. And I think most people are, well, I'm not sure how everybody's sensible enough to think of these ways. You still have to work out what you do and promote yourself even at that level. But
yes.
Don't say I'm doing this because it's sometime in the future. Or if something different happens in the future, all well and good. But don't let it destroy where you are, or enjoy where you are. That's what
I think that's really good. I'm glad you said that, because that's sort of, I wanted you to, because you said this earlier.
All right.
And I think this is really important, because we've got this sort of commoditization of things. We do this thing in order to do this type of idea, right? And I think actually that's quite a recent thing, because, again, going back to, when we were sort of younger, you could do an apprenticeship in the old style, not whatever they think is an apprenticeship now, which was you spent a lot of time working with somebody who was an old hand at doing that thing that you're learning. And your learning was a long time. And you weren't, it wasn't sort of organized in such a way that you had modules and all this sort of thing. You just learned doing the thing. And that would have been true for everything. It would have been true for music. It would have been true for, being a
bricklaying,
or a chippy or whatever. And it wasn't like, you just learned by being involved in observing and just picking it up almost unconsciously. And as you say, there was it wasn't this sort of thing that there was a thing in the future that you might, become good, but it wasn't necessarily accepted that that's what was going to happen, because it was just a case of you just carried on doing the thing. In that moment, you were just working. And I think that you're absolutely spot on with this, actually, because I think this is the important thing about music. You do it because you want to do it. And I remember Mick Jagger saying about Keith Richards, he plays the guitar because he has to. And I thought that was so accurate about what, not just Keith Richards, but I think not because he wanted to be a star or anything, because he had no choice. He had to play. And if we had that feeling a little bit more with things, then, you play football because you had to. That's what you do. And we've lost that, or to some extent we've lost that. It's not that type of way that people think, if you're going to play musical instruments because you want to do it, not because it's going to take you anywhere necessarily. I don't know how we get that back into things. But I would say that great musicians actually do that. You get to that point where those people, they just play because that's what they do. It's not because they necessarily want to. Well, they do want to.
It's quite frightening the way computing power is still hasn't run its course. This law that computing power doubles and halves in price every 18 months, that is still going on now. There are new types of computing, new types of storage, and who would have it's almost already there are computer programs that can do all sorts of things, and whether you'd end up with a computer that could almost play the saxophone as well as Coltrane, sort of thing. That's quite.
Yeah.
I find at the moment there is still that human element manages to do something that even the best computer can't. But
yes, and I think actually that's the point, because I always think about everything that we experience is really a reflection of what goes on in our heads, whether it's the left side of the brain, right side of the brain, whatever. And, the analytical thing, that sort of left side of the brain where we want everything like delineated and whatever. And then you've got this other side of the brain, which just gets the big picture, but it's not that sort of bothered with detail. And that's always the thing that's being pushed to one side. It's the arts and it's all the rest of it, right? That's this good reflection of what goes on there. And I think that's the thing, that the analytical thing always thinks it's going to get to the point where it's got the answer. And I think what's beginning to happen now, you hear it more and more in discussions, in science and stuff, that maybe this is unknowable. Maybe this bit is unknowable. And we just have to be content that we will never know that. We might be able to work this out or get a computer to do that, but in essence, we don't know. And that's something I never heard an awful lot, even 20 years ago. And I'm just wondering whether that's the thing that's going on with, as you say, about could you get a computer that could play like Coltrane? That music, that human element, is that the unknowable bit, the unpredictable bit.
Well, coming back to your footballer, the footballer who knows it's a good idea if he runs into that space, because you'll be able to score a goal in 2 seconds time. Sort of thing.
Yes, but the thing is, that's not an intellectual thing, is it? It's almost that they're drawn to that place somehow. They just sort of know, but they don't know why they know.
No,
and that's the thing that happens with music, I would say. Know that's the thing.
It's in fact, certainly when it comes to jazz or popular music, that when you're improvising, when to join in, when to play, when to do this, when to do the other. That is still an exciting thing.
It is, and I think that's what I'm getting at. It's almost that part of our consciousness that you can't sort of nail down. You can't really explain it. It just is the thing that's going on, and of course you can't teach that. You just have to make people aware that there is that element that you could be open to. Because again, if you're talking about improvisation, how do you say that? You can say, well, what are you feeling? What you're hearing in your head, and express that in a particular way. But you can't really delineate it, can you? And I think that's an important bit. So that's I think it's a really interesting point. And again, there's no answer to it, but it's just a case of whether we can be open to that. So the computing thing I think is interesting, as you spent a lot of time in the world of computers and stuff. I think that there has to be some way of us balancing out in our own minds about what those things can do for us that's beneficial. Without it, this is a technological thing which has come up again and again on the podcast. Technology comes along, and I always use the Hendrix analogy here. I knew a couple of people who were there when Charlie Watkins brought the wah-wah pedal prototype,
right,
into Vox Jennings, and said, "Look, guys, look what I've created." And he plugged the guitar in and did this thing, and some people in the room went, "Yeah, what's that then, Charlie?" "It's a tone pot in a box." "No, it's amazing. Look, it does it." And they didn't get it at all. They didn't get what he'd created. And then they gave one to Jimi Hendrix. And then Hendrix obviously did his thing with that. And then people started to buy the wah-wah pedal to sound like Jimmy. Now, that's what technology does. Some people can do things with the technology that they've got in their head. And then other people do the thing because the technology makes them do the thing. And there is a difference there, a massive difference. So then what happens is we start doing the thing because the technology makes us do it in a particular way. So that takes me back to your thing about the backing tracks. Because that's a similar thing. It's that you start singing because the backing track makes you sing like that, you know. It's the people who can get the backing tracks and still be able to do their thing over the backing track, not to sound exactly like the original.
Right.
And that's a different mindset. And a difficult one for people to be able to literally get their head around. And that's not just backing tracks, that's everything to do with technology, I think. And that's a challenge.
Technology, some of the technology has been really helpful. I mean,
yes.
You can get a whole reel book in all that can transpose every chart you're ever going to play.
Exactly. On an app. I know. I've got it. It's wonderful.
Mountains of paper being all over the place in the wrong order.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. But again, that's the thing about, you know, technology is a great servant, but a terrible master. Yeah. And we so easily make the technology make us, it masters us. Yeah. And that's the thing that is really difficult to get a balance on. And of course it always happens because it's easier just to go with what the technology enables you to do, and that's it, and I've done with it. But I just, that's going to be a challenge that's going to be ongoing. But I think it's a case of people being aware that there is a choice. What do you do with these things? So the other thing I thought was quite interesting with that is the great musicians are always sort of a bit of an anomaly. You know, they can play brilliantly, but they do things differently. And I think that is something which is, and you must see this in jazz a lot when you're looking at really great players.
Well, they've got all the chops. I mean, I won't give any names in this story, but a young player got a job with a really famous band. And he thought, gosh, this is brilliant. I'm going to be so musical. I can express myself, which is absolutely true. But after one gig, the old, experienced, very, very famous person said, look at this YouTube someone's put up of us playing in a German club. That was a brilliant solo you did that line. I want you to do that again. And the young player was quite upset because I thought I was with a guy who was really into it for the sake of music. I mean, a copy of solo I did one particular night.
Amazing. It's
all part of it, you know. It's and in fact, if you go back to the heyday of what you might have thought of as popular music, so the big bands after the Second World War, the kids would go out to jive dance to these bands and be up. They'd want to hear the solo they'd heard on the record. They didn't want to hear these guys playing jazz.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that's like the technology of the recording.
Well, that's right.
Making that.
Yeah. And so there's so many things in this that and ultimately I've become much more, although I started off promoting jazz, I end up doing quite a lot of popular music now. I mean, there again, I was invited by Chiddingstone Castle to do live music, which we've done now for a couple of years. And that's increasingly, you can see people turn out for a show of the Beatles tribute or songs of Stevie Wonder. Some really top quality gypsy jazz doesn't quite get the numbers, you know. So it's all part of a mix. Yeah, it is. That's interesting. And I've interviewed a few people who are in tribute bands, and some of them do the tribute thing sort of their way, and other ones try to stick exactly to the some are a celebration of the music and some are complete copies. Exactly. And that's and again, that works. Work.
it works. It works. You know,
some he get the Stevie Wonder tribute. You might have seen it around. I mean, Derek Nash and Noel McCullough do. It's all jazz musicians, and we have our cake and eat it. Because if you're a jazz person, you'll hear what you want to hear, and if you like the tunes, you'll also like it. It's
yeah. So, they've always fascinated me because I've always taught kids from the point of view of you need to understand what's going on in the head of this player, because you don't just want to regurgitate that thing. You want to understand how this guy could have come up the next night and played something else,
right.
But you can still inhabit that place that musician's got, and say, if it's good to be able to learn a solo exactly off the record, because if somebody's going to pay you to play that, then that's fine. But you should have the option. You don't just do the thing because that was done. Because in certain cases, the next night they would have played something else. Not in all cases. Some guitarists have the solos, and that's what they're going to do. Yeah. But it's interesting. Well, John, that's a lovely chat, and it's good to see you. Because as you pointed out to me, that was nearly.
Tell me, did you remember that?
Yeah, I did. And it was strange because no. It's only when you put that poster up that it was like, yeah. I remember that now. Yeah, because it was a lovely bandstand. Because it literally was a bandstand on the green, wasn't it?
Indeed. It's still there.
I can't remember anything about what we did, though, to be frank.
No, I can't either. And I can remember being realizing it was an experiment, and sadly probably would not be repeated. But as I say, that is now a venue regularly used, and I think that we blazed a trail for it.
Well, this is it. Maybe that's what, like we were saying, that the outcome of that was not quite what we expected or anticipated, which was something, sort of an Edwardian-looking bandstand. It's still there, Yeah, it's brilliant. Anyway, it's lovely to speak to you. I'll put some things in the show notes for how people can get in contact and find out what you're doing, because you're doing some great stuff. And it's mostly around sort of Seven Oaks, Tunbridge Wells, and
I say all in Crawley, home counties, south home counties.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a lot of people in this area, so that's good. All right then, John. Thanks ever so much, and
thank you very much for inviting me, Vic. Great fun.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, mate. Absolute pleasure.